The nation of Israel stood in mourning, their hearts heavy with loss and uncertainty. Moses, their great leader, was gone. The man who had spoken with God, who had led them out of slavery and through the wilderness, was no longer with them. For 40 years he had been their guide, their voice of hope, the one who stood between them and the unknown. Now, silence filled the camp. The familiar presence of Moses was gone, and the people felt the weight of change. The people wept, feeling lost and uncertain on the edge of the promised land. Their dreams seemed just out of reach, and fear crept in. But God had already prepared a new leader, Joshua. Joshua wasn't a stranger to them. He was a man of courage and faith. He had served Moses faithfully and had once seen the land with eyes of faith, not fear. He remembered God's promises when others doubted. While others saw giants, Joshua saw God's promise. He believed that with God nothing was impossible. Now the mantle of leadership passed to him. The responsibility was great, but so was the calling. God spoke directly to Joshua, cutting through the grief. "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan." The time for waiting was over. The future was uncertain, but God's plan was alive. A new day was dawning for Israel. Joshua had to rise above his fears and trust that God would be with him, just as he was with Moses. He needed courage for the journey ahead. The people looked to Joshua, their hope mingled with doubt. Could he lead them into the unknown? Would God truly be with him as he had promised? Joshua faced a choice: shrink back in fear or step forward in faith. The moment of decision had come. The nation's future rested on his shoulders, but he was not alone. God's presence would go before him. God had made him a promise of strength, courage, and victory. A new chapter was beginning, filled with hope and challenge. Joshua, son of Nun, stepped into the light, ready to lead his people forward. The journey into the promised land was about to begin, and with faith, a new future awaited them all. Imagine the pressure Joshua felt, stepping into Moses' shoes. The weight of an entire nation's hopes and fears rested on his shoulders, and the legacy of a legendary leader loomed large before him. Fear and doubt must have whispered, "You're not enough." The uncertainty of the unknown, the enormity of the task, and the fear of failure could have easily overwhelmed him. But before Joshua gave a single command, God gave him a gift: encouragement. God knew Joshua's heart and spoke directly to his deepest need. 3 times God said, "Be strong and courageous." Each repetition was a reminder that Joshua was not alone in this calling. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, a promise that God's presence would be Joshua's strength. God was not just encouraging him, but equipping him for what lay ahead. "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." These words were meant to anchor Joshua's soul in every challenge. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but moving forward because you know you're not alone. True bravery is trusting God's promise even when the path is uncertain. Joshua's strength would come from God, not himself. His faith would be his foundation. God's message was clear: you focus on obedience, I'll handle the battles. Joshua was called to trust, not to strive alone. With this assurance, Joshua stood tall. He was ready to lead, not by his own might, but by God's promise. He gathered the officers and gave his first command: "Get your supplies ready. In 3 days we cross the Jordan." The moment of action had arrived. The words carried new authority, not from Joshua, but from God. The people sensed the shift. The journey to the promised land would be fueled by faith and courage. Every step forward was a step of trust. Joshua was no longer just Moses' assistant. He was God's chosen leader. The mantle had truly passed. The people prepared, hearts pounding with anticipation. Excitement and nervousness mingled as they readied themselves for a new chapter. The time for wandering was over. The days of uncertainty were ending. The time for promise had come. The land awaited, just beyond the river. God's presence would lead them forward. His guidance would light every step. The adventure was about to begin, and with God leading the way, nothing was impossible. The first obstacle was the Jordan River, swollen, wild, and impossible to cross. Its waters surged with the force of spring floods, making the river a daunting barrier for anyone who dared approach. An entire nation stood at its edge, Thousands of men, women and children, wondering if their journey would end before it even began. The promised land was in sight, but the river seemed to say, "You shall not pass." Joshua didn't focus on the river, he focused on God. He remembered the miracles of the past and trusted that God would act again. He told the priests to carry the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, and step boldly into the raging water, even though it seemed impossible. No bridge, no shallow crossing, just faith and obedience. The only way forward was to trust completely. The priests obeyed, stepping into the torrent with courage, their hearts pounding as the cold water swirled around their feet. As soon as their feet touched the water, the river stopped. The impossible happened before their very eyes. Upstream, the water piled up in a great heap. Downstream, it flowed away, leaving dry ground where there had been only rushing water moments before. God parted the waters again, just as he had at the Red Sea for Moses, showing his power and faithfulness to a new generation. The people crossed in awe, fear turning to faith as they walked across the dry riverbed, marveling at the miracle unfolding around them. The priests stood firm in the middle of the river, holding the ark high until everyone had safely passed to the other side. This was more than a crossing. It was a sign, a moment that would be remembered for generations. God was with Joshua, just as he had been with Moses, confirming Joshua's leadership in the eyes of all the people. The people's hope was renewed, their faith strengthened by what they had witnessed together. They stood on the soil of the promised land, hearts full of gratitude and anticipation, ready for what lay ahead. God had made the impossible possible. The journey continued, and a new chapter in their story was just beginning. The next challenge was Jericho, a city with walls that seemed unbreakable. God's plan was unexpected. March around the city once a day for 6 days in silence, with priests blowing trumpets. On the 7th day, march 7 times, then shout. It sounded foolish, but the people obeyed. For 6 days they circled the city in silence, trusting God's word. On the 7th day, after the 7th lap, the trumpets sounded and the people shouted. The walls collapsed completely. The path into the city was wide open. Victory came not by might, but by obedience and faith. God delivered Jericho into their hands. The people saw that God's ways are higher than ours. Their faith was tested and proven. The conquest had begun with a miracle. God's power, not human strength, would win the battles ahead. The lesson was clear: trust and obey. The promised land was theirs to claim. The journey pressed on. After Jericho, the Israelites faced Ai, a small town, an easy target, or so they thought. Overconfidence led them to send only a few soldiers. But the attack failed. They were routed and fled in defeat. The people's confidence shattered. Had God abandoned them? Joshua cried out to God, desperate for answers. God revealed the problem's sin in the camp. One man, Achan, had disobeyed God's command and taken forbidden plunder. Because of this, the whole nation suffered. Sin, even in secret, has consequences for everyone. Joshua confronted the sin, and after Achan confessed, the people made things right. God's favor returned. This time, with God's guidance, they defeated Ai. The lesson was hard, but vital. Victory depends on obedience, not assumption. God's presence cannot be taken for granted. The people learned humility and dependence on God. Every step forward required faithfulness. The journey continued, wiser and stronger. With renewed humility, Israel's conquest of Canaan accelerated. When Gibeon tricked Israel into a treaty, 5 kings attacked. Joshua honored the treaty and marched all night to help. God fought for Israel, sending hailstones and confusion among their enemies. Needing more time, Joshua prayed, "Sun, stand still!" And God answered. The sun stopped, and Israel won a miraculous victory. God's power was on full display. Nothing could stop his promise. City after city fell. King after king was defeated. The land was being claimed, just as God had promised Abraham. Each victory was a testament to God's faithfulness. The people advanced relentlessly, empowered by God. The promise was becoming reality. Israel was finally home. The battles ended, and it was time to settle the land. Joshua, now old, oversaw the division of Canaan among the tribes. Each tribe received its inheritance, not by politics, but by God's direction. The land was a gift, a tangible sign of God's faithfulness. Caleb, now 85, claimed his promised hill country, still strong in faith. Cities of refuge were established, and the Levites received towns among the tribes. Every detail of God's promise was fulfilled. The wilderness generation's journey was over. Israel was a nation in its own land. God's covenant love was visible in every field and city. The book of Joshua says it plainly. Not one of God's promises failed. Every promise was kept. The people could finally rest. The story of wandering had become a story of home. Joshua's story is more than history. It's a guide for us. We all face our own giants and walls, obstacles that seem impossible. Joshua's life teaches us to listen to God, even when his instructions seem strange. Success comes from trusting and obeying God, not from our own strength. When we stumble, like at Ai, we learn, repent, and keep going. God's presence is our courage. The same God who parted waters and brought down walls is with us today. Our role is to be strong and courageous in his strength. The journey isn't easy, but God is faithful. He keeps his promises. We can face anything, not because we are strong, but because he is. The wars were over, the land was theirs, and Joshua was old. He gathered the tribes for one final message, not about victories, but about the heart. Joshua reminded them of their story, God's faithfulness from Abraham to the promised land. He challenged them to remember who had fought for them. Then he laid out a choice. Choose this day whom you will serve. The temptation to follow other gods would always be there. Joshua drew a line in the sand. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. His words echoed, a call to commitment for every family. The future depended on their choice. God keeps his promises, but we must choose to walk in them. Joshua's legacy was not just conquest, but faithfulness. The story ends with a challenge. Who will you serve? The choice is ours every day.